look at that empathic notion of socialism and then go, oh, but wait, this doesn't work beyond the tribe kind of thing. This does work at this level, and we all instinctively know this is the way forward and this is how we should treat people. But the problem is we're in a figurative sort of in this global village, but we're not.
There was apparently in India, just prior to COVID, again, shows what the news is kind of informing us about, but there'd been, and I don't know the dates, but let's just say within 2 or 3 years, I think it might have even been within 1 year, there was the biggest general strike there's ever been in the world. Like, it was 100 million Indians. So that's
wow,
right.
How the
and then,
hell
but then
do
wait
we not
for it.
know that?
But then wait for it, and then
that's the one thing you aren't going to find out.
But then
about.
subsequently, there was the new biggest one that ever been, and it was 250 million. Like, so there was a second strike. So that was in India, and of course all of that got shut down.
This is the Panopticast. Conversations at the edge of freedom.
The effects of real world socialism, and I think if the only two games in town are capitalism and Stalinism, then even I'd jump on capitalism. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Exactly. That's it, innit?
So it's like, and that's the kind of Faustian bargain that sort of that Agamben talks about as well. And I think so if it isn't, and I always find it difficult because if on the one hand, I mean, even Marx said, he says something like, don't expect me to, what's the phrase, outline the recipes for the cookbooks of the future sort of thing. Mm-hmm. He talks about the real movement, and that it's actually through real struggle and real kind of praxis, in the world, that we find, alternatives that nevertheless, in his view, would have to overturn the the structural properties, the systemic properties of capitalism. So, he was always against the kind of tweaking and reformism because, even sort of state redistribution and stuff, it's still caught up within the laws of capital accumulation, and at any point it ultimately threatens the overarching, surplus accumulation. It will tank the system, just in this, in the same ways as government interference now. So in that sense, it was like, no, it has to be system change because the sort of stuff that these other political economists are talking about just doesn't work if you understand the mechanisms, or you can, even social democracy ran aground, didn't it? Like Keynesianism came up against stagflation and then, and had to be wiped out, and that's then we got the kind of neoliberal sort of counter-revolution. But point being is, if there isn't something else, if there isn't whatever you want to call it, like, democratic socialism, more like you were saying in that journey thing, some kind of, horizontal collectivism.
Yeah, some decentralized. Something that should. Yeah, then that's it.
And that's why Carson, I was always like, because it's fucking simple, right? If we're going to try anything.
And there's something about that simplicity where, and you've got to be really careful with simplicity, obviously, right? But then you've also got to be really careful with being wary of simplicity. It's like that.
Yeah.
It goes both ways. And I always, and the reason I'm never very militant about it, and I don't speak with any authority about it, is because I'm not, like, I've got a simplistic but appropriate, I think, view of that whole dynamic between capitalism, socialism, and the third option. I'm confident in my view of it, but I don't discuss it. And I'm even careful, like, when we're talking about it, because the simple fact is I'm not informed enough about certain elements of it. I've not even read Marx, right? And the reason for that kind of is it factors into it is because every time I've gone to read Marx, I've started, and something's always made me say I've got better things to read. And it's a stupid statement to make when someone's as important as they are. And Jesus Christ, Manifesto's a pamphlet, right? But the thing that's done it is when I've just thought, right, well, there are things inherent to this that I'm never going to get beyond, no matter what follows in these preceding pages, right? It's like, the simple example, I always refer to that Proudhon thing of the people themselves having complete control over their portion of, capital and their own labour value, right? So then, and I suppose what overlays over that as well is a slightly suspicious, if not conspiratorial view, where it's like, why does, when you've got those ideas, like in Proudhon's time, like just before in the forebears, talking about being important, that the people have to have control of their own unit, and then someone as potent as Marx comes along, and basically puts forward the idea that incorporates all those ideas that are already in the ether at that time, and then puts his own slant on it, but that it's like the applicable version. Do you know what I mean? It's like the one that people will get behind, and not only the one that people get behind, but the one that business will get behind as well, to a degree, because it's still centralizing. Not business and corporate, but you know what I mean? But it's still required. It's like in order for you, in order for you to put forward a model that could compete with capitalism, you need to get everyone on board to sort of assemble quotients within every group to get on board, or like to make it feasible in order to go against capitalism, right? So it feels like it's almost like, and I get that, and I get the pragmatics of that. I get the practicality of saying, look, yeah, great ideas, but we need to find a way of implementing this in a way that it's actually feasible, and that this model then is actually worse than this model, but it's got a chance of getting somewhere, kind of thing. So anyway, so when I'd come to it, I'd always come away, but always knowing I have to go back, but always just being, as we always are, the stack of 10 books that I think I need to have read yesterday, right? I'm always in that zone. So I'm always aware that I don't talk with authority about it, because I do feel like I'm just not informed enough about certain elements of it. But to come back to that simple thing, it's always hilarious to me, and I suppose this is another simplistic flag. It's funny, innit, how we've got, if you just get rid of all the ideology and just say, what's the nature of our reality, our political reality, it's that we're presented generationally now, like multiple generations, 3-4 generations, we're presented with two viable options, and everything else is kind of silly, like you don't even take it seriously. And one option caters to the selfish, tribalistic, me and my own rather than anybody else mindset. Basically everything that isn't the capitalism, everything that's got the most primitive, non-social, like reactive, I'm out for my own kind of hunter-gatherer brain, right? If you kind of like the hunter-gatherer in a mode of panic is capitalism, right? It's like, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do for me and mine, right? And I'm going to be extremely cynical about, in a sort of a game theory sense, I'm going to be extremely cynical that anyone over there would do any different to what I'm going to do, so I'm going to fucking do this, right? That's one option we get. And then the other option we get is, this ostensibly on the surface beautiful, definitely progressive and empathic idea of, community and, to each according to his needs, right? So to have that, and then it's like, and just leaving aside all the sort of ideology for a second, just going, and interesting that between those two, you basically, with capitalism, you get pretty much everyone, especially in this day and age, you pull most people on board. And then with this one, you mop up all the people who have evolved beyond that to some degree, but still, but haven't evolved to the point, evolved's not the right word, but haven't maybe progressed to the point, or we hadn't as a species in terms of just, awareness of psychology and stuff, haven't progressed to the point where they look at that empathic notion of socialism and then go, oh, but wait, this doesn't work beyond the tribe kind of thing. This does work at this level, and we all instinctively know this is the way forward and this is how we should treat people. But the problem is we're in a figurative sort of, in this global village, but we're not in this global village, not really on a 80% of what's running my decision making processes aren't operating at that level. I can intellectually say, yeah, I care about those people in that country or whatever, but you just don't at a very deep level. You don't, even though on an intellectual and sort of conscious level, of course you do. This is because it's what you want to be, and it's what you favour in humankind and all the rest of it. So we get these two options that just mop up. There's no one outside of those options. Right, the only people that don't find us aren't happy in there,
and on this sliding scale between
exactly, there's no one that isn't catered to in there, other than the people who say both capitalism is just simply not ideal. It's just simply dog eat dog, and it has all its obvious negatives, and socialism's short-sighted for the reasons as just laid out, right? So, as in it's trying to apply a global answer to something that only works tribally. And then those people go, okay, so what's the alternative? This is the third group of people, right? And then there's Kevin Carson again. Like it's kind of, you can't. I don't see how people don't just go, oh right then. Well, I do actually. You need the once you've got the psychology and the sort of Dunbar's number and the tribalism, you've got that stuff nailed down, and then you've got the dangers of centralisation and just which I think requires, kind of like the chap I was talking about before. Like this does require a heavy cynicism about what centralisation has done in the last 100 years. Like centralisation of power has done in the last 100 years.
Yeah.
So being heavily cynical about what centralisation does, heavily cynical about the limitations of human beings and what they're going to do to fuck each other over, combined with the sort of awareness of those two critiques of those two economic systems, you can't come out the other side of that with anything other than decentralisation, catering to human limitations until hopefully we can outgrow them, and it all points towards, you know, small collectives that are part of a broader sort of synaptic federated community, and definitely, you know, co-responsive and mutually in need of each other and all that, which is probably kind of a priority for it. I'm not saying there's a whole range of different, from anarchism to whatever, different ways of looking at something like that. But the fact that's, well, I suppose that is the only conversation that's really fruitful now.
Yeah. I think
because the answer's in there somewhere, whatever it happens to be.
Yeah, and to be honest, and it won't be something. I mean, what I think is quite good about Kevin Carson, especially as he kind of developed into, because he used to call himself a sort of, I think he called himself a mutualist, and then he called, you know, at one point he was sort of a market anarchist or whatever, and then in the end he said
anarchist with no suffix.
Yeah, or prefix, yeah, one way or the other. Yeah, probably both. But that's because, you know, it probably would be a patchwork, and there would be diversity. You know, there would probably be some communities or some areas where there was more of a kind of, you know, anarcho-capitalist sort of market-oriented sort of form of social organisation. There'd be other places where, there's always going to be some of that. There's going to be market exchange.
Surely that's
but
exactly
more kind of common in sort of organisation.
Yeah, you know, I can't remember who it is. I think it might have been Nazim Taleb. You know Nazim Taleb? Come across him?
The name rings a bell.
I think it's him, and he tweeted at some point, like the sort of hierarchy of economic systems and how you apply them to people in your environment is like, I'm at home, I'm a socialist, you know, in my broader community I'm a whatever, and he keeps getting more and more distant until when it's the person right over there. That's exactly it. It's a continuum, isn't it? And within some model like that, there's space for all these systems to exist, but basically the yardstick, the sort of the how you decide where it should be implemented is first and foremost human capacity, human frailties, and psychological frailties, and what we actually do, not what we say we're going to do, or what a profound, some charismatic JFK can get people to believe. That's all so dangerous, you know. Like you don't convince people they can do shit they can't do. They'll get excited about it and emotional and you know, put you on a pedestal, but really you should be focusing on, and this is, I'm so wary of ever doing the Jordan Peterson thing, because it's almost like it's cliche now to talk about Jordan Peterson, but I think if nothing else, the great value he's got is just a heavy cynicism about what you can expect out of people, and I think if you work from that as one of your primary directives, it steers you pretty straight a lot of the time, dodges a few minds.
Yeah, but I think the problem is one, that in terms of when his forays into kind of economics and social organisation, like, people don't realise how planned the sort of quote-unquote markets are of today. And like, even Hayek, who, you know, is seen by many as a kind of, I mean, he's not an anarcho-capitalist, but he's seen as right on the kind of fairly extreme end of market fundamentalism. I mean, he's the kind of one of the people who's quoted as the kind of fathers of neoliberalism. But, you know, he recognised in a lot of what he wrote that competition had to be installed and instigated through some form of kind of state management, you know, making sure that sort of competitive conditions are in place and so on. Like, especially now with the kind of immaterial labour and intellectual property, I mean, the ends to which the legal system is being, and Garson makes this point, you know, the ends to which property rights are being kind of forced onto things, you know, especially kind of, you know, on the internet and information and things that otherwise would naturally
all systems being applied.
Be commons. I
mean, the
mean,
expectations and assumptions of old systems being applied to new things that they've got no place in being.
And even the
it's
old
very Foucault, actually, isn't it?
And even the old systems, I think, I think what Carson's argument is, in a way, that what he's describing is closer to what would have just naturally evolved, aside from all the interventions of power to kind of construct the rules of the game, if you like, impose particular property rights or whatever, expropriate large bodies of property and land, which then lead towards more kind of large scale forms of production.
But that's history, isn't it? That is definitely history. History is the natural evolution of systems like that with then dominant influences within the human sphere, dominant influences stepping up to mitigate and minimize that evolution so that it can be a conduit, it can be a bridge between that power and everybody, or that benefit and everybody, or whatever.
And so that's Carson's criticism of a lot of people who, like to appeal, I guess, to, things like, some of the things you've been mentioning around, this is the limitations of human beings, we need to, appeal to people's more, base incentives and, not expect.
I wouldn't say base incentives, but like just limitations.
Yeah.
Like psychological limitations.
Yeah.
What you can, not even what you can do, but what you can be relied upon to do.
Yeah. Well, in a way, it's a combination of like Mises and Hayek. Like Mises talking about human action and kind of, in a way, I would say, naturalizing or ontologizing like the market, because he starts with the very basic sort of Robinson Crusoe situation. I think we've talked about this before, but in a way, sort of demystifying economic terms, like, well, what's investment is when you spend a bit more time delaying immediate gratification in order to spend time producing things that then will allow you to be more efficient in the pursuit of that immediate gratification in the past. So, when Robinson Crusoe, spends that time building his boat 'cause he's got just enough fish to kind of feed himself through that period. Now, he could go kind of fishing more and, be gluttonous and so on. And then, so in a sense, it's savings and investment. It's and kind of, the different forms of human action that have then essentially kind of manifest. So he sort of tries to naturalize it, so there's that element of sort of not even human limitation, but almost like he's trying to say this is inherent in the choice architecture of human action. It's what we would naturally be doing. And then on the other side, you've got Hayek sort of talking about knowledge limitations of acting outside of a particular sphere of kind of knowledge of various different types. So and the way the price mechanism coordinates that. But when you go beyond that kind of, I want to say kind of fairy tale, I mean, it's not, in a sense, it's true as far as it goes, but when you actually go beyond that to the real world, I think Carson's argument's more accurate. Like, all of these things have been, that these things have not just evolved as a result of human action and the limitations of, human cognitive capacities. They've been installed, and we'd have probably had a very different. Carson talks a lot about the imposition of the national railway networks, where huge moneyed interests were kind of paid taxation systems, like enabling national rail networks that would never have organically generated that degree of investment. Because it was oversized, the returns, if they even had returns in the long run, would have been so far into the future, they might have bumped up against people's more natural proclivity to kind of have those smaller scale communities. So, those things would have never happened. The way in which, the notion of large malls and sort of warehouses and all of those sort of, what's the word, they're all based on the transportation system. They're all based on costs that those companies don't have to pay because the infrastructure's been invested in. And like there's people make economic arguments to say, oh yeah, well that's the role of the state because these are public goods. But it's like, is it really? And what is it then? If they couldn't actually mobilize that investment, then maybe that indicates, especially if you subscribe to the likes of Mises or Hayek, maybe that just indicates that that's not what people would have wanted to kind of save and invest in.
Yeah, and this is the thing with
and then one last thing on that, just to kind of, and I've said this before, I know, but like then if you look at all the kind of hidden costs, social costs that have arisen from the way in which our food's produced, the way in which things, the way in which the global economy operates to ship things, all the all the way around the world.
For long to get extreme.
To be like, all right, we're just not really paying the costs here, so this is a totally false economy. And
that's in a way as well. That's why, to connect this back to that other thing as well. When you take that third option and go, okay, decentralize it. To be as super simplistic about it, just decentralization down to that sort of level that caters to an evolved habitat, what we psychologically well geared for, right? To go in that direction has all the benefits. It has the benefits of neutralizing this this dichotomy between capitalism, socialism, or whatever. It's like, right, it's I think, arguably, I think it's a clearly superior solution anyway. The only cost the cost it's got is potentially, maybe not, but the cost it seems to have is, like rampant neurotic growth. Like, might not get to Jupiter as fast. You know what I mean? But like maybe we shouldn't be trying to get to Jupiter at the expense of everything else we've got.
Well, exactly. If there wouldn't be the willingness, again, just drawing on sort of basic sort of market economics. Why would any of us really sacrifice the kind of the ability to create a park for our children, or the ability to build more community in order to go to Jupiter? Like, it's only
it's
like
the incentives of the individual.
Kind of...
Yeah, it's the incentives of the individual versus the incentives of the like amorphous, the weird, hard to pin down agency that exists behind the collective. Which is usually
not even obviously the individual. Like I say, it could be like community amenities. Like if you were at the Democratic Forum saying, okay, right, we're all sort of, we've got our individual distribution here, within our little whatever market and mixed with commons-based kind of exchange.
Yeah.
And we've got some surplus that we've agreed we want to use for sort of public goods, collective goods in our kind of community. Yeah. Now, do we want to siphon off some of that to pass up here to contribute to the space race? Be like,
if you could gift an African village with anything you want, it'd be a hard push to gift them with a space program.
Yeah, exactly.
At any point, not even once food's taken care of, then a space program. No. Now we'll do this.
You've got some crazy Elon Musk try to petition the communities to say, oh no, we'll be able to mine. Like, oh God, look at that crazy. Yeah. Look at that Luna.
Yeah, well, that thing of that the way that third option, to me, setting aside that, as long as you don't get behind the kind of cult of not just the neurotic expansion of wealth and power and all the rest of it, the growth, the unchecked growth, we just need to get bigger and bigger, or the more rational version of it, which is forward escape. No, we need to do that because the scientific developments that will come by a century of charging forward, even though we're going to break a few eggs, charging forward, the scientific benefits that will come will mean that then we can back off. It's like as a species, we'll have done our 20s and 30s and we'll be able to relax now, and our generations that follow us are going to get all the benefits of all that sacrifice that we made, and now we're going to have that Greek agora. It's been an ongoing... Yeah, we're almost there.
Just a little carrot.
So leaving that aside, assuming that that's complete and utter bullshit, you get in that third option so many things catered to, in terms of all the concerns people have got, in terms of whether it's like the sort of ills of the West and suicide and everything that's demonstrable negatives since agriculture, basically agricultural revolution, basically, All that's gone, while still being able to maintain the infrastructure that keeps antibiotics and keeps the benefits we've gained so far. Does all that. It's got a sensible, a highly sort of practical and evidenced just as a political response, right? But then also to get back to, like you were saying about the sort of the costs that in capitalism, kind of the costs that people don't even know. We're just externalizing these costs to the ecosystem or whatever else it is, and usually just poorer people somewhere else.
Yeah.
And without even being aware what it actually takes to get that cappuccino in your hand or whatever, right? You instantly, those assumptions that we've built up over the last not just 100 years, but like all on the journey towards capitalism, all those assumptions that have ended up being built into the system that you're kind of alluding to, and that kind of gets into a lot of kind of on the edge of Foucault, and just recognizing the assumptions that we're operating under without even realizing we're operating under those assumptions anymore, right? It just the act of going backwards, by definition, has to reel that back in. Like even if you could almost say, like, even if we don't know, and we do know a lot of it's easy to identify, but even if we didn't know of all these externalized costs and all the many ways, and we probably don't know many of the ways that we're paying a huge price for it, right? Even if you didn't know any of them, you can see by their effects that they exist. We can see what's going on in the world, right? And just in inequality or whatever, right? So you can actually be lazy and not even do the science, do the research to find out exactly where we're fucked. Just go back a bit. It's like walking into a fire. You don't need to, if you're feeling hot, just start going backwards. There's no mental process needs to be done there. It's not worked for the individual, and for what most people would put as like human ideals, the benefit of mankind kind of thing. It's not worked for that, what we've done. So just the act of going backwards sort of corrects that anyway, doesn't it? So that's just another dimension to how that third, the kind of Kevin Carson. I haven't found anything in Kevin Carson actually that I'm where I think, oh well, I don't agree with you there. Like everything he basically says. If someone said to me, "What's the answer?" I'd say, "Go read Kevin Carson. It's already been figured out."
And it's not an answer, is it? It's not a blueprint. That's what's good about it. It's not really a blueprint. It's just like,
and it's tested.
You see all these
it's not a hypothesis.
Here. Like there's like what's it called now? There's the land trusts. There's just such a plurality, and this is always going to have to be the case, because the problem is people go, oh well, describe your system right, as if Adam Smith described in advance how a capitalist economy would work. Like, no one did that. There was never, like, unless I've missed something major in the history of economic thought, I'm pretty sure I haven't. No one designed capitalism before it came about. Do you know what I mean? Because, and in a way that's why Marx could say, don't force me to, don't expect me to, provide the recipes for the cookbooks of the future. Like, what happened was, as a system started to emerge that were becoming more dominant and we were moving towards a market economy, astute, thinkers at the time were able to try and what's going on here and sort of start to systematize what was going on. In the same way as, like, no one should be expected to kind of write out, although of course, there should be some expectation to say, oh, well, what could this look like and so on. But yeah, the thing with Carson is it isn't that, because it's just very, polyvalent. It's polyvalent, I think I meant. There's various different sort of values and so land trusts, forms of kind of market exchange, commons-based peer production, especially in the sort of information ecology, whereby there's no costs there's very limited costs in kind of transporting. So you can have very global systems like the open source movement. You can have governance systems like ideally would operate in science, which would be important for that community to kind of flourish, and obviously some kind of formalized expectation that there would be some surplus given over to that because of the importance of pursuing knowledge and because of the kind of innovation that it can bring. All sorts of different forms of governance that would respond. I think the problem is that both sort of socialism, or at least sort of whatever 20th century socialism, and capitalism are actually, they call it like market monism. It becomes it infects and kind of homogenizes every sphere that it enters. It's like the guy
and thought as well. Like the
Yeah.
Like you've often, one of the things you've repeated quite a few times over all those discussions is that people find it easy to imagine the end of the world easier than imagining the end of capitalism.
Yeah.
And I think the thing that's behind that, I think they'd say the same for. You could apply this. You could use the same quote and say people find it easy to imagine the end of the world than the end of the dichotomy between socialism and capitalism.
Yeah.
Because it's like that. We've existed within that pool so much that you can tell yourself you're a free thinker, but you see it over and over, and with myself as well for years. I think you've kind of got to get. You've almost got to get fanatical in another direction. Your only escape from it is to become a fanatic for something else, to sort of trick your subconscious leanings, and almost be like, kind of just whatever, identifying with rebellion from both kind of thing, in order to free yourself to go, oh, what's this Kevin Carson guy talking about? Or whatever. The fact that exists, and it's not it and other people like him, it accounts for so much of a small piece of the discussion. You've got to then say, like, well, two things that can easily be, corrected and adjusted and critiqued. This thing that can't really, because I think, is that fair to say? Like, if you were going to sit down and you were going to try and critique him, under what other than the basis of, we're supposed to be fuck breaking a few eggs, we're just supposed to charter Jupiter. Other than that, like collective, amassed technological potency, which actually he could probably counter with everything with. The way that his worldview actually incorporates cutting edge developments that we're not even quite there yet, with 3D printing, localized manufacturing, all the rest of it. It's very possible he could present arguments that would suggest that actually the efficiencies to be gained actually end up competing with that part of the argument as well. But leaving that aside, what do his critics say?
I mean, it's probably not big enough to have attracted like a lot of critics, but what I would say is, I think the only thing you could say, I mean, you could take issue with it, I guess, in terms of if you were, very, if you ascribe to kind of socialism, you could take issue with it. But putting that aside, or vice versa, if you ascribe to kind of modern capitalism, but I would say, which in a sense isn't a criticism at all, I'm sure you can find examples where, because in a way what you're talking about is governance. Even you can see the market as a form of governance, and just going back a step to the thing where you said, one of the problems is not just that it's difficult to imagine the end of capitalism more than the end of the world, and you rephrase that as end of capitalism or socialism, but
the dichotomy between.
Between. Well, I've told you before about the famous tragedy of the commons, which was an essay written by Gerrit Hardin that was really quite influential on policy, whereby it said, these certain forms of goods like forests and other fields for pasture are sort of commons, and they're at risk of being overexploited unless you have some form of governance. Well, we can either have, an authority, i.e. a state of some kind, even if it's a local state, owning that and imposing rules that people have, and then policing those rules through, a form of state authority. Or we can have a market, and that was that kind of dominant. And then let's look at all the problems with sort of state authority and the type of knowledge problems that Hayek talked about. It's like, okay, well, really probably the only solution is a market. And then Elinor Ostrom sort of goes, sure, that's not how it works in practice, and like looks at historical examples, looks at present examples, and says, oh, look, there's this thing called common property rights, and look how these norms have evolved. So yeah, again, that's just one example of how that rigid thinking, in spite of like empirical reality under people's noses, was ignored. But to your point on Carson, then,
just to connect that back to the sort of Carson political conclusion, that when we're fixing the hypothetical threat of the tragedy of the commons, the problem with that, let's say it was right, even if that was a totally accurate position to take, right? The problem with it is people operating as if there's plenty more world. We can just keep milking it and keep going further and further afield, right? We can keep I've exhausted these resources. I'm now going to go onto these ones, and I don't have to take care of these because there's a field that's ready to plow over there, right? And that's because of the nature of the
and if I don't do it, someone else will.
So an instant fix to that. This is another thing that the fix is just built into the system in terms of this decentralized view, is that if you've got a border, it's like because you're going back to the sort of tribal reality where different groups of people are going to be controlling different areas, and we've got enough people now that most areas would be controlled by to some degree, right? You're bumping up against someone else's border, so then you're forced, rather than just being able to just keep milking the commons, you're forced to hit the border and go, all right, I don't have rights over that land, so now what I've got to do is I've got to take care of the longevity of this land, and you push back into that. Which is what a tribe would have done, right?
Yeah, exactly. The argument there is that if you live in the world that they're assuming you do, where you've got all these individual farmers, let's say, even within a bordered area, they're going to be like, oh, damn, the farmer's gonna graze on this pasture if I don't, so I might as well do it to get my sheep as plump as possible, or whatever, so that we get more wool. So I think like that, but of course the reality is that there are more, you could call them tribal structures, the type of things, I mean they're not a tribe per se, but the type of things that Ostrom then went and explored were included, amongst other things, embedded norms that had developed within that community that had become almost habitual. I mean, there did need to be some forms of organic sort of policing, in inverted commas, to avoid kind of anyone who was willing to break those norms or whatever. But in general, it was much more, organic than people would have anticipated from looking at it purely from, say, a game theoretical point of view, which is what Harding was looking at. But yeah, to the Carson point, and Carson's written about Elinor Ostrom. He's written about all the open source and the production of knowledge commons, like Wikipedia and all the open hardware stuff where people are developing things and putting the schematics online so that people can then utilize them and evolve them. The stuff you mentioned earlier about the he takes on board a lot of the stuff from about appropriate technology and human scale. I forgot the name of the authors. Takes on the stuff about the land trusts. And I mean, I can't even remember them all, but basically you end up with this really diverse patchwork, but different governance systems that would operate well for different types of human activity. So I think the only critique in that regard would be to find a few things that but none of those things could apply to this. But in a way, that's no critique at all. It's kind of like, well, what he's trying to do, I think, is kind of document and sort of coalesce the inherent diversity and the capacity for humans, when sort of left alone to some extent, to find solutions to problems that if you only applied this kind of narrow game theoretic point of view, or if you tried to impose sort of grand theory in the way Garrett Hardin did do, might seem impossible or obscure or force you down. Oh, well, we need state control, or we need we need a market to be developed around these things, to just show no, there's all this kind of diversity. I mean, the other one he talked a lot about was the kind of Emilia Romagna model of kind of federated small scale co-ops that then, when large contract opportunities came up in the global economy, would essentially federate to essentially be able to meet that demand, which otherwise would require a large organisation. But instead it was just all these workshops kind of working together in a network. Various other different forms of networked organisation that allow certain scale challenges to be addressed, but then don't remove the kind of local ownership and the kind of all the other things that come with that around communal embeddedness and the sense of artisanry that can be more pronounced in a sort of small scale operation. So it's really, I guess, just, it's in a way the irony is, because the likes of Hayek and many sort of market commentators talk about the spontaneous order of the market, and it's complex systems dynamic. And when you read sort of the types of things that Carson collaces together, you see actually this is much more of an ecosystem. This is much more about real diversity. In a way, the market's imposing a kind of monism, like a single solution and a single set of governance rules, if you like, that is actually artificially crowding out, because it's being imposed through power, one type of power or another, crowding out the actual real diversity that would flourish, in a world in which power wasn't imposed in that way.
Yeah, and that's sort of not precisely, but gets close to something I was just going to say about if you were going to critique that sort of that social organisation of that decentralised model, right? If you're going to critique it, I've got a critique and a response instantly, and then a historical example that all tie it all together. If you're going to critique it, you'd say, well, if you were going to just do that tomorrow, you're the global hegemon that's got 10 years to put this into place, kind of thing, or 50 years to put it into place. Well, how do you decide? We're not tribal anymore. We're so globalised and differentiated, and people are identified in very different ways to how they were. Where's the border? And why? What suggests that you'd be on this side of it or that? Or is it just literally we just lay out all these little hexagons across the planet? And it, without trying to gauge a response to that, well, I'd say the best response to that critique would be, well, look at what worked, right? And this is if you look at what worked with the Celts, like across all of Europe, the vast majority of Europe and the British Isles and a few other places, they were racially completely distinct, like culturally distinct. Didn't speak the same language. The only thing they shared in common was they worshipped the same gods. That's it. It's that simple. And as a result of that one religious unifying principle, Rome didn't really touch them. The reading of history says, like, you would imagine people say, yeah, Rome smashed everyone. Rome was never fully took over these islands and had to withdraw, and so that's it straight away. Never got, never took over Germania, like stopped at sort of what would be roughly Prussian sort of German sort of area, right? So there was an invasion and then a withdrawal, and the historical picture is that Rome conquered, but really they failed to conquer this entire region, I mean like the continental region, for one reason, and it's that someone who didn't even speak the same language could travel 300 miles and meet and break bread with someone who worshipped the same gods and say, right, we're together on that purely on that basis. Now that, that's like, if there was ever a way that it was going to be possible, what is the unifying principle in the modern age, especially a post-religious age, if we're even going into that? And if actually there's every sign in the last 15 years it's going in the other direction, to be honest. But devoid of, absent religion, you're talking about like, it's a mentality, innit? The only way that comes about now is a mentality, kind of like the hacker collective mentality. It comes about through that sort of, that mentality of it's almost an arrogant mentality of anyone who's not on this train is just an idiot. You're living in another century. If you went and hung out with some hacker community who were totally kind of up on sort of Carson and hacker collectives interacting with each other and already doing exactly what we're talking about, but in the way of sharing technology and open source stuff and all the rest of it. You sit down and have a couple of hours chatting to a lot of those people, and there's almost a not superior, but like unavoidably superior. Look, this is the answer. The answer's already been found. It's just trying to get it out to people now and get them to know. If enough people had that mindset, where you can look at the ills of society and civilization, and you've got a solution that fixes them all, and nobody can bring forward any way to critique what you're doing, well, then it's just implementation, with the slight problem that the entire amassed governing dominant power structure on the planet wouldn't want that to happen, right?
It's a slight problem.
And but that's it, innit? I think that's the bottom line. Like, the answers are there, even to the point of a unifying principle that on a global movement level you could get people totally behind it. The simple problem is that within that world, all the old hierarchies are done. The bad hierarchies are done. The good hierarchies can stay. Like, there's nothing wrong with, whatever competence hierarchy and whatever. Like, it's not. It's just a. It's kind of. It's almost comical in that it answers all the questions, fixes all the problems. The only thing you're left with is this one power problem, right? And similar to what we we're kind of saying with Marx before. I mean, hypothetically, I don't know if that's true or not, but saying like, what Marx's output might have amounted to was a sort of a very minor degradation of what other people would have put forward in order to make it viable, politically viable as a movement, right? That might not be true. I'm just saying, let's just use that as the example, that my hypothesis about that as the example. In a similar way, maybe what the answer is now is the people who've got that hacker collective mentality, for want of a better term, and informed in that way, to find the way, and I think this is probably why people get behind crypto so much, to find the means by which this gets dispersed now, like to everyone, not geeks, like literally to my mom.
I think in a way this is one of the cause just on the Marx thing, I mean, I think, to compare, say, to someone like Proudhon, and I must say I've not sort of read Proudhon's sort of over, and I've read some things about what he's written and so on, but the overarching consensus, and I think the reason that Marx became, or at least one of the main reasons that Marx became so dominant, is because of his critique of capitalism. In a way, I think it was just that a much more sophisticated, I think at the time, he was the best, and people read it and they were like, wow, this analysis is kind of sort of first rate and explains so many things and informs things. I guess it's certainly true that even with, putting aside the fact that it said don't, make me kind of provide the recipes for the cookbooks of the future, there was within that critique there was an implicit sort of politics about how the capitalist system would have to be overcome. And also I think he definitely was on that, we were talking about earlier in terms of how can we get to Jupiter quick enough. He recognized the revolutionary potential of capital to remove all of those old customs and binds that were preventing kind of increased technological advancement, and to basically push humanity to a point whereby socialism would be a viable superseding system that did require the kind of advancements of the means of production and the force of production. So,
but it required.
The point I wanted to make in relation to what we last said, otherwise we'll kind of move up from it, is that so it wasn't purely linked to competing with power, but there was the element in terms of the class struggle whereby, if you think about what we've been talking about over text earlier around the kind of transnational capitalist class, or the whatever we want to call them, the power elite or whatever, and the way in which those class interests and or manifestations of power are embedded in various different extremely powerful institutions, you can see why, certainly at the time, it's much harder now, but it would be, well, we need to seize the monopoly on violence as well. The working class need to seize the architecture of the state, through the vanguard or whatever, and you see where all the problems come from this. But you can see the logic as well. Like, if we don't, if we don't meet power with power, if we can't, we're just, dismantle that power in order to create,
we're green lighting continued hegemony, basically.
The workers' utopia. Yeah, I mean, any kind of, alternative that's, springs up in whatever, factory takeovers and what the anarcho-syndicalists wanted, for example, in terms of federated workers' communes, that then, if you don't address the kind of capitalist power that's manifest in these state apparatuses, then it's just going to wipe you out, in the same sense that the sort of free software stuff went along okay in the end, but then ultimately, because of the power and dominance of the capitalist system, it kind of very quickly got incorporated, and it's kind of the idealism that the Free Software Foundation represented versus, you know, open source that integrated with property rights and kind of then just became almost like providing some of the infrastructure like the state does for the roads or whatever. It kind of, that's what it's ended up doing for, and so Capital goes, brilliant. You do this kind of, you know, infrastructural work, and we'll just build all our kind of proprietary, the same as the internet, like in a sense, like, you know, with what's he called, Bernard, whatever, the guy who invented, and kept it as a commons, because actually capitalism likes certain commons. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, not to detour too much. That's I think one of the major issues, and in a way, Carson documents the extent to which, you know, when feudalism sort of morphed into capitalism, those same power interests operated in order to make sure that it was a form of hierarchical capitalism that wouldn't take advantage. You know, so for example, he talks about the neotech revolution. I can't remember all the terms, but it was basically the point that actually with the invention of electricity versus steam, like there's something about the production of steam that requires large scale kind of structures that can utilize that energy source. In a sense, electricity, you know, I'm massively simplifying now, but is more appropriate for the kind of Emilia Romagna kind of confederated smaller scale, the ability to kind of utilize smaller scale power tools and all the rest of it, and the, you know, the, if you like, the kind of, what's he called now, the guy, the phrase is like the cultural pseudomorph from the feudal era was able to kind of influence the kind of cultural manifestation of early capitalism and so on. So I guess that's probably the major issue is, you know, there is a power structure. It doesn't even, you know, in some sense it will act in concert, but it doesn't even need to do that. It's as a system will protect its kind of own interests. And
just to tie to something, you know, what we just said then about the emergence of capitalism, you know, was
overshadowed or whatever.
Birthed, you know, steered, whatever, to make sure it sort of manifest in a way that could be orchestrated in the way that it is, right? To tie that to something,
it's kind of like, just to give a really good example, concrete example, it's kind of like when Russia, you know, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, when it progressed into capitalism, it was kind of like, it wasn't, things didn't get decentralized, or it was just the oligarchs were the ones that then, you know, had all the wealth. I mean, that's essentially, you know, putting it very simply, what happened, you know, during the expropriation of the commons and all the stuff that birthed.
So and this is it, that's exactly making my point, that the same could happen in reverse, right? It could happen the other way as well, or you could have you could have a socialist system that shifts to capitalism, or a capitalist system that shifts to socialism, and because it's got you know, a hierarchical elite based control over capital and labour, the hyper elite aren't affected. And that to tie that to what we're saying when we were texting before about it, whenever I'm sort of averse to the idea that you know, like the transnational capital class or whatever, if it's, as soon as it's put in capitalist terms, to me it seems like it deletes, it obfuscates, or at least defocuses, it focuses too narrowly and says, right, okay, so it's capitalism that's the problem. Whereas you could lose, like when I said in that thing, you could lose capitalism tomorrow and I don't think it'd make a difference. And I was being trite about that, but I mean, in the sense that I think it's dangerous to just be focused on the transnational capital class, because there's lots of indications to say this is the case. In the next few decades, we could very easily be faced with a socialist response, you know, in exactly the same way that you get, you know, there's something that placates to human psychology to shift between the sort of left-right divide. Have a right winger in, have a left winger in. People, well, let's try him now. This didn't work, bastard. Right, let's try this one again. Right, the Blair phenomenon. Right. In the same way, it would be very easy, especially in the current climate, to get a lot of people behind a global, even to take to this degree, shift to socialism. even when people have said, all right, it might be a little bit dangerous, but it's better than this chaos we've got now, right? People will go that way. And I think if everybody has been conditioned or has been habituated to seeing this global transnational capitalist class and the focus on capitalism, then that creates a huge blind spot where people would say, right, by definition, all the things I'm afraid of are capitalist centered. So therefore, just by going to this polar, it's probably a fairly safe bet. And in this day, with this much chaos, people will take a fairly safe bet. They'll take in fact, at this point, they'll take a 50-50 gamble for the chance of getting out of what we're in, you know.
Well, that was kind of, or even not a gamble, even like, you know, I mean, a way what Trump was, at least
that's
small way,
perfect.
was more
Yeah,
like just to fuck you, just
Yeah.
like,
people just to
this
make a statement.
guy's gonna be like
That's so true.
anarchic,
Yeah.
and like, but
And
because,
what a dangerous
because
zone
we're
you're in
offered
when-
with no, you know, this is the only sort of sense of agency or whatever of any influence on the system.
Yeah, and people can, in huge swathes, can end up just for doing the fuck you, can go into a movement.
A fascist.
Movement, well, they go into a movement, and then what they can end up doing, though, they can go into it even on a pure orientation of just fuck you.
Burn.
But they can, but over time, they can end up ideologues for it. They can end up, you know, it's like, well, this is my team now.
Yeah.
So just on a very subconscious level, over time, you can start building rationality, justifications for why you have the position you have. You know, you're forced to have these conversations with people on the other side of that divide, where you're going to get bored of just saying it's just a fuck you. That's all it is. You're going to get bored of doing that, and you're going to start saying, well, you know what? Especially when you get someone like Trump's, it's almost perfect. Like he turns up as that option for fuck you, but then, you know, anyone that actually looks diligently, not at what fucking most of the press reports about him, but anyone that looks diligently at actual policy and then compares it to some of the stuff that, like Obama or whatever, that gets elevated. You can put Obama and Trump next to each other. They come out pretty even. In fact, I'd say Obama comes out worse overall. Not in how he demonstrates, not in how he expresses himself, of course, but it's like this perfect example of how people now, they're not looking at what is, they're looking at what I see, you know, what is represented to me. So you can get someone like Obama that's hyper polished, but was one of the worst presidents for the last 40 years in terms of what he actually, the further steps he took in terms of drone strikes and actually attacking American civilians, doing the shit that Bush would have never dreamed of trying to do.
Yeah.
So you can take someone who's polished but abhorrent, and then you can take someone who is abhorrent, you know, on the surface of it, but what I'd nail my colours to the mast on is no worse than any other president for the last 40 years. You know, like, no. And
I mean,
so,
I just don't know enough to say that. I mean, it's I probably am only.
And
like,
I'd agree with that. I'd say I don't either. But what I'm basing it on is I have seen no evidence, and I've looked for it, and I've had people desperately trying to find it for me because they were averse to this position. No evidence has been presented to me that anything that guy has done is worse than any president for the last 40 years. And in fact, my overall leaning on what people have tried to bring forth is that I can show you how, you know, there's ways that Jimmy Carter, Reagan, Bush, obviously, Obama, all were demonstrably worse in unique ways, not in a sort of an overarching thing. Whereas I can't find that, other than that he's abhorrent and it's like a depressing death of culture to have that guy running the entire show. Like there's a negative there that you can't really quantify. Like to what does it do to a society when that is the person who is held most aloft above everyone? Like that's its own fucking question, and we're not going to know for generations. Well, a generation. So I'm not by no means am I behind Trump, but that thing of where he where there's not a lot of it always seems to be, to be honest, that the president you get in the era is precisely the president that brings about exactly what would suit, and to keep it very, very, you know, vague and open, would suit any intent towards greater collectivist hierarchy, you know, vertically collectivist. Well, keep it even simpler than that. Any intent that wants to remove value from the collective and concentrate it within a hyper elite, right? Whoever and whatever that might be, though that intent, you can look at every presidency since the 30s, because I don't know much before that, to be honest. You can look at every presidency since the 30s, and you can show how the net effect of that presidency served that shift. It might have favoured war here, it might have favoured anti-war here, it might have done a million different things, but the net effect when you took up the presidency on balance was, even if not within the short term, a greater concentration of power and influence and money within the elite and taken away from the poor. Even if not in the short term, at the minimum, as part of when you just zoom out just a couple of presidencies and you see how, you know, as a president can alleviate the pressure, or like Obama, the hope machine or whatever, you know, you can see how in the end that's the pattern it's the only pattern that's clearly identifiable at all times. And I can see it, you can look at that and say, like, oh, you're spotting a pattern. It's not evidence, that's a pattern. Patterns are evidence, you know,
Well,
especially
yeah,
when
I
there's
guess-
no counter pattern. If someone could say, yeah, but here's another pattern that says Obama was this, or the president's involved in this, but when there's only one dominant pattern and everything else
Yeah,
fails.
but the explanation for that might just be that that's because they're actually, you know, when all's said and done, not that influential. Do you know what I mean? That thing's happening, and these people just kind of.
Well, I mean,
but
yes, but
I
at the same time, you can see actual acts that have been taken that have then, you know, whatever.
Yeah, but
they're
not the
just
authors
the
of the acts,
central
are they?
banking, you know, the sort of the Federal Reserve Acts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's specific ways that it's like a guy pops up and he just dials it in loads of different ways, but he does that one thing. Like, you can find the one thing that every president. It's almost like, if you want to put it in some sort of a South Park sensibility, it'd be like, just do this one thing at some point and then do whatever the fuck you want with the rest, which always fits nicely as well with when you've got like oil oligarchs like the Bushes or whatever that turn up, and generally what they do is achieve these key arguably geopolitical benefits for transnational capitalists, if we're going to use that term just for the time being. They achieve that movement forward in terms of a new world order, or however you want to express that, and then they get themselves rich as fuck while they're doing it. You know, it's like, hey, make some money for your family, establish your dynasty, fine, but just do these sort of couple of things. So yeah, I do think there's an actual. It's not just a case of stepping back or being impotent next to the real powers that be. It's that they are actually responding to it. And I think even down to, you can take this down to the sort of the Kennedy level, where I think it's the same thing with him. And the problem was, once in, he just didn't make good on the promise kind of thing and started going into some very different directions. And that's exactly why he got what he got.
Yeah.
It's the one conspiracy I'm happy to just nail my colours to the mast in the open on.
Yeah, and for, I mean, Obama. I mean, again, I mean, I don't follow in detail at all kind of different policy decisions, but like you said, if you look at the sort of geopolitical impact of the Bush administration, whose father, both president and director of the CIA, was also instrumental in, and then with Obama, I mean, the one thing that stands out is that he actually, like you said, the hope machine, the I think is he a constitutional legal, he's a kind of he was a lawyer of sorts as well, so I think that was another thing. Or after the Bush era of kind of running roughshod over kind of law and creating extraordinary rendition and
and someone who basically exemplified, for want of a better term, just like hick mentality. Like he just it's like he was playing
Bush.
to that. And there's a lot of reason to believe that he wasn't anything like that, actually.
No.
You hear some interesting conversations with people who say you'd be interested to meet him, like when people have said they found him to be actually quite intelligent, quite eloquent, and you're like, how is that the guy that stood on that carrier?
It was definitely
so so much was played up to play that persona.
Just on that Obama point, though, in a way, a kind of the first African American president, someone who, for all appearance and even in everything he said, was seen as the antidote to Bush in every way, but especially in the sense that this regime has been. That was the 9/11 regime, wasn't it? It was the regime of the Patriot Act, the Bush regime. It was the regime where, American exceptionalism, was put on steroids, and, the legal order that the liberal West, the rules-based system that it kind of touts, in a sense, as its ideology and virtue and mission, was significantly undermined by the war on terror and the extraordinary rendition in Guantanamo Bay. And in fact, Obama even on his platform was saying we're going to close Guantanamo Bay and so on. But then I've forgotten the name of the act. But essentially, going back to the exception stuff, state of exception becoming the norm, he then passed another act that essentially formalised and put into law to the long term. All the stuff that had been done during the Patriot, the drone strikes and so on.
Yeah.
So yeah, in precisely your point, you've got this figure, as I say, a constitutional scholar, or at least has.
He looked like exactly the statesman you want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But who then sort of sealed the deal on the kind of
because as well,
and
and this was exactly at the time. This was my main soapbox point, right? People's general position was, look how great this guy is. My negative position was, look how great this guy is. Why? Why would a demonstrably more intelligent, even assuming no agency above the presidency, a demonstrably more intelligent statesman, power seeker, why would you be comfortable with that? Oh, that's slightly open, but why would you not be in fear of someone who is as eloquent and as good as he is? Why would you not be in fear of the cult that's going to come behind that? Not just the people that are actively for him. I'm talking about the people who go, oh, the guy's got it, and they look away, which is why you get the Bushes effectively setting all these balls in motion, but could never really get busy pushing them down the hill because there's too much attention on them, right? Because they've got just the entire sort of Democrat they've just got the effective mass of American media and culture and civic sort of awareness pointed right at them and critiquing them almost to it's the cultural, it's the culture. It's like with Trump, it's the cultural thing to do, really, right? Unless you're really in the backwoods of Texas somewhere. They set all those balls, get them ready, and then go, no fucking way, I'm pushing that down that hill. Obama turns up, and it's like, there's no one watching me. Okie dokie. He can do that because no one's paying attention. And even if he gets caught, the thing, I'm like, look at this shit he's doing. And then when he gets caught, then it's just like, and he just starts doing he's not an amazing orator, but he's better enough that people were like, yep, I'm sold on him just kind of...
Is very calm. He is a good orator. Yeah, I mean, I know what I mean, because it was always, I think the American people understand that, because I think, I mean, it's not only what, it's partly linked to what I was saying, and I can't remember the name of the acts, like I said, but all the Snowden stuff, revelations, was all under his
stuff
watch.
That really mattered.
The encroachment of the national security state, and to the extent that it now is. A global police state, to use that title of, was all pushed forward. I think even, under the Bush era, I'm not sure, I mean, I might be wrong on this, but I think it still wasn't allowed that it was non-US citizens that all these kind of extra legal definitions and responses could be applied to. I'm pretty sure it was under Obama that it became actual American citizens, and I think it was Obama that actually... okayed the drone strike against an American citizen. Bye habeas corpus. Bye. I mean, that's like everything. Now you might say, oh yeah, he was definitely a terrorist, but I think they then killed his son as well. It's kind of like,
they did kill his son.
Yeah,
and it's that, and this is what's important. It's he stepped out. He stepped outside the realm of where he could even. Where it could be argued this is a difficult position to be in as a president. He stepped out of that zone into the he crossed the lines that are kind of mythic. He killed an American, and was aware he was doing it. It was, It was and it's almost,
it's murder,
it's almost like you. It's almost like that. You can't help but think that he, what a great threshold. Imagine assuming this some sort of a transnational capitalist elite with tendrils that can affect presidencies. Assume that for a second, right? Well, if you are that capital, that transnational elite, there are certain thresholds you want to see crossed. Taboos broken. In order to move forward towards greater and greater sort of collectivist control, right? And one taboo would be things like when those taboos broken, like say drone striking an American and his son at a wedding. right? You don't want Bush breaking that taboo. Bush breaks that taboo, and you've got a lot more societal unrest. You've got a lot more failure of belief in the system, the integrity of the system, and all the rest of it. When Obama does it, especially, and this was my primary thing, when Obama does it, especially when everyone they are publicly, visibly, socially, at the lower level and the broader level, committed to this guy. I watched a lot of people. It's a bit like, in a similar way you talk about the Corbyn situation was an awakening in a certain way. In a similar way with me, I was already kind of onto it with the Obama thing, but the awakening was, I thought, oh well, you'll all get it. When I was having the conversations early on, and I had British kind of slightly anti-statist friends having American flags and shit. Like, it was ridiculous, right? And because I saw him as a solution in so many ways. I remember just thinking, oh well, you're gonna see it quite quick, so I'm not gonna get too emotional about it. But then when he was doing what he was doing, the justifications that people were giving, I'm like, if this was Bush, there's no way you'd do this. And then you realise there's only one explanation for it, and this is the problem with the hope machine. I'd say it's probably the most dangerous machine that exists, other than the big one. The problem with the hope machine is once you can get people to be really committed to an idea, all but a great minority of them struggle to go, yeah, I missed that. I'm wrong. And they'll to a far degree they'll stay behind it. They're in the cult. They're in the cult, and once they've nailed the colours to the mast, and they're connected to people who also believe it and all that. So they're in a self-sustaining ritual at that point, and that in itself is so lethal. So to tie back to the thing of what does he get away with, and what would a transnational elite want to see done? Well, you would use Obama to the short version of what I'm saying is, if you were the transnational elite and you did have control of the presidency in some way, if you get Obama as your chess piece, you go, okay, what is this chess piece good for? I'll tell you what he's good for. He's good for pushing all Bush's balls down those hills, and he's good for breaking some taboos. He's good at doing the things that no one else would get away with, but the person that comes in after gets to do it after that, because the precedent's been set.
Yeah, precedent's been set by
Mr. Shiny Teeth.
Yeah.
And let's face it. Well, sorry, go on.
Well, I was just saying. So, linking back to the kind of solution stuff and the Carson stuff. I mean, he. It seems like the Deus Ex Machina, for Carson is the fiscal crisis of the state. I think his, in terms of, well, what's the thing that enables this to kind of actually happen? So
it's in the post.
Yeah, and so for Marx,
it's not looking good.
So for Marx, it was there's going to be consolidation of the means of production. You're going to get a increase in socialisation within capitalism. The kind of growth of large scale organisations. So in a sense, there's material conditions for why the working class will literally become more of a collective entity, and at that point, so long as there's class consciousness and you've got blah 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 blah, right?
Class consciousness being the problem. That's the
what in your
opinion?
In
these words, in my opinion, yeah, just that people, especially when you look at the way we've
not to derail come about, or...
well, the way that we've social media. Just look at now so much attention's put on just completely reducing people's any consciousness.
Yeah,
let
I think the interesting thing though about Marx at the time, we're in a different era now.
Yeah.
But
I'm not critiquing him there. I'm critiquing its chances now.
But it really did happen, didn't it? So in a way, it was kind of right. If you look at the way the labour movement grew, and it sort of happened again for materialist reasons because of those kind of reasons. Once you're in a large scale organisation, you see the commonality with your brother. You're like. And what's happened now is, precarious working, fragmentation of the labour force, more networked forms that it's much harder to kind of organise. And if you're actually in the factory or the massive factory, with your co-workers, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so anyway, that was the thing. As far as I can remember, for Carson, it's like, well, in a way, he's almost drawing on, a lot of what would happen in less formalized state structures, like where informal housing can happen because simply the state doesn't have the resources to police this stuff anymore. So it's almost like, I think he saw it as a kind of an outward escape of a slow descent, but I guess he wouldn't see it as a descent. But as the state increasingly becomes incapable of generating the revenues required to police and govern, all these various different arenas, from intellectual property rights to, so they can't stop the file sharing anymore, to, planning, even now you look at local councils and I don't think they have the capacity to kind of enforce planning laws. They'll of course, if someone complains or if there's big egregious things, they'll come out and do it.
They couldn't stop a big enough movement.
They couldn't stop a big enough movement, and they can't stop loads of small things happening because they just don't have, I think, the capacity to police anymore. So in a way, they've become more tolerant and less. But all of that, all of the things that are required to actually police this stuff, and so I think that was his that's when these organic forms can actually kind of become more prevalent.
What would be his response to?
But sorry, the point being is, like, because we're saying in a way that the issue is the extent to which power and the power elite, etc., will allow these things to happen, and obviously the opposite's the case. Like, if you think about, I mean, it's crazy that it's so similar to what was done, say, in Soviet Russia, where they, and Carson talks about this a lot, in a way that modern capitalism is, in terms of the size and scale, is enforcing, if you compare it, say, to Gandhi's vision of the kind of federated, smaller scale workshops, if you look what it's done to the agricultural sector in terms of removed all that kind of more sort of ecology in both senses, in the natural sense, but also in the variety of smaller scale kind of forms of agriculture that are much more cognizant and tending. The way in which they've enforced terminator seeds through sort of Monsanto and all the rest of it. They've dispossessed, capital, in the form of, in this case, Monsanto and a few others, have essentially dispossessed the workers of their means of production and come to kind of cannibalize their ability to actually work the land and reproduce. So on the one hand, there's like, how do you stop the green shoots, if you like, from being attacked, and closed down as soon as they become a threat? And on the other hand, how do you stop the kind of further predation of, let's just say, less compromised or less cannibalized forms of production as they exist, that are being increasingly sort of absorbed into the kind of control of global capital, as manifest in terms of, say, the big social media companies or the big agriculture, or think about all, lots that's written about the way in which knowledge has been expropriated from indigenous communities and then patented into pharmaceutical products that are then sold back to them. The way in which the academy and universities and the scientific community have sort of been cannibalized. And it comes back to the point I make, like, once you control, even with the sort of small scale Carson stuff, it's more feasible because you're like, okay, actually, these are small outlays of money, of capital, to be able to say, some of the stuff you highlighted around those open source tools for the creation of civilization, the machines that can create the mud bricks out of mud, and you can build a house, the kind of CNC milling machines that allow you to create all sorts of things, to the point that you can then build your own tractor, so all that kind of stuff it's attractive because it's like, all right, so all you need is like a bit of land and then a small amount of investment, and you can actually get going, and then you can see how you could be kind of linked up and so on. So it is more feasible in that respect, but at the same time, the sort of concentration of investment power, and this is the point I was making in the text, like that is in a very, very literal sense, the power to create the future in the image of the present, or in whatever that.
Why
image
is it
of
not
the
bigger? Why is
future
it not? That's true, obviously, but surely even that is just a side note within the bigger story of monopoly on force, being able to step. Even if that you know, in the like he's talking about the breakdown, he's seeing the benefit of the breakdown of the financial system or whatever. Like he's not talking about like that. He's just talking about the sort of failure of America specifically, right?
Who, Carson?
Yeah, as the seed of opportunity,
the fiscal
right?
exhaustion of the state. Yeah, that's what.
And that's similar to what you're doing. That's centralizing the sort of the capital factor. But even in that situation, then how does this grow when all that happens then is the force that's put to the wall in that situation still has physical force to be able to step in and alter it, which is why so a question, and well, I'll follow just 1 second. So first of all, how is anything below that level of where power residing in terms of monopoly on violence, how is that not the only thing to address? And my tentative sort of solution to that, because there are solutions to that even as well. Like as soon as you're looking at that as if you're looking at the financial level as being the problem to solve, then all of your responses are very different to if you go, hang on a minute, this is the real problem, this monopoly on violence thing. And as soon as you look at the monopoly on violence thing, then you're forced to you've got very, very fewer ways to respond to it, but they're still viable. So like my sort of go-to would be, if that's true, if that's the apex of where sort of power resides, if you like, and where force would be applied, to overcome that, what you need essentially is the sort of Carson's thing, the hacker collective mentality, if you like, applied like Harry Potter. You need Harry Potter level spread on planet Earth. I'm talking about the contents of the book.
I don't really know what that means.
I'm just a phenomenon on the level of Harry Potter,
right,
that puts that hacker collective mindset. And the way that we've just talked about it for an hour, about how like this isn't a hard thing to sell to someone. Like you can't, I can show you all the gains, how it solves all the problems, and you can't give me a single thing that's wrong with it, right? In terms of the Carson's view, right? So it's not a tough sell. You just got to get it onto enough people's plates, right? My argument would be, if you've got a effective majority, critical mass, whatever you want to call it, of the West, who have Carson's ideas, have that hacker collective mindset about this decentralization model, and see its benefits, and are disenfranchised enough based on all the shit that's going on. So there's a little bit of that kind of financial, what Carson's saying, tied into it. Once you're in that situation, well, then you've got what's referred to as general strike, right? Like if you've got, because downing tools and being prepared to be punched in the face like Gandhi, it's going to come. It has to come to that in the end. It's at least it's within the limits of my conceptualization of this stuff. I can't see how anything doesn't end with something akin to that general strike idea of enough people downing tools that the system just stops, and then when force is applied, vitally, because it has to come back to that force. When force is applied, the capacity to stand there and be killed, knowing that only so many of you are going to get killed before this, exactly like Gandhi proved, right? So that my response there is operating at that level of force. If any conversation that's just talking about, the level of capital or capitalism or a financial collapse causing something, how is that? I know Carson's a smarter dude than me, so I'm sure he's got an answer to this. I just need to know. How come that is the level that he's pointed at, when he has to know, as far as my worldview is, that even in the situation of, and other than having a Downing tools degree general strike, a general strike level thing of Downing tools, without that, you're just dealing with police, you're just dealing with force, direct force on the streets, telling you exactly how we're going to live from now. Like this is literally your mandate. You will get up at this time, you will be at the factory by 8, you'll just be told what to do, and if you don't do it, you'll get shot. And unless you've got, and the only way, once you're in that situation, you are fucked. There's no recovery from that, unless you have a movement in place that can down those tools and is prepared to get beaten with a stick and never give up. Like, unless you're going to do that, I don't see how anything at that level below fixes anything. It just diverts attention from how to really think about that level of the problem. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, so I would probably say two things. One is, there's always been that tension between that there has to be spaces for experimentation as to what does come next, because you're almost presenting it like, people have seen this, just to put it crudely, like seeing this blueprint of like what it could be like, have kind of intellectually bought onto that, and then need to kind of topple a power structure to implement it.
Just to the degree we would be bought into it.
Yeah, but what I mean is,
recognising that it's something worth fighting for, almost something worth going to war for.
Yeah, but my point is, there has to be as many green shoots of that actually operating in practice. So, as I've said, like all this diversity of, land trusts and people have experimented with that. And if that was if that was happening more, there was more of that, like, I don't know what the tipping point is, but then also there was more, of the kind of Ostrom stuff, and there was more of the, there were these nascent institutions, and people, then you can go, oh yeah, and we see where science has kind of come from and gone wrong, although it was never an ideal system. We see like, so it's, we can see how we can move back to that, because it is, it's literally impossible. And I mean, many people have said this, but I mean, Hayek amongst others, we're not capable of sort of redesigning a society. So there has to be some kind of evolution of new forms of institutions, old institutions being rehabilitated, etc., etc. So I guess, that's partly, I think, where Carson's coming from. As the state becomes fiscally exhausted, as it can enforce the zoning laws and the intellectual property rights and so on, like, we have to, this is the opportunity to grow these things, and eventually then that, there can be a tipping point. Maybe then, to come to my second point, there would at a certain point be a confrontation between, if you like, the old system that's dying and holding on and seeking to hold on to power, and still has control over the means of violence. And I imagine by that kind of hypothetical point, its legitimacy, would it be even less kind of secure in terms of people voting and what, except, and its claim to be democratic and all the rest of it. But that power, you can imagine at the same time there might then need to be a general strike. And I think, I was reading in that book, interestingly enough, because the one about COVID and the extent to which it's been a power grab by the elites, irrespective of,
or at least it's been
utilised as such. There was apparently in India, just prior to COVID, again, shows what the news is kind of informing us about, but there'd been, and I don't know the dates, but let's just say within 2 or 3 years, I think it might have even been within 1 year, there was the biggest general strike there's ever been in the world. Like, it was 100 million Indians. So that's right. And then, but then wait for it. And then
that's the one thing you aren't going to find out.
But then
about.
Subsequently, there was the new biggest one that ever been, and it was 250 million. Like, so there was a second strike. So that's that was in India, and of course all of that got shut down. Among with the yellow vests in France, with all these kind of huge kind of forms of resistance. It wasn't just those two. There was, when they've looked at the data, people gather the data as to the amount of anti-government resistance in various countries, and it was off the scale. It was historical and precedent. But just let me finish to that point. So I guess you might never get the general strike where everyone's sort of in it, but when you've got that level, and you've got all potential emergent alternatives, then you can see a point at which I guess the question is,
I feel like you've just put the grenade in that position. Like, the fact that there was that strike of that level, 250 million people, and we don't know about it, to me that demonstrates that this is never going to happen. But I totally get your point. The slow incremental creation of circumstances where this is a viable possibility now. That is totally appealing to me, right? That in 20 years from now, everything you said made perfect sense. I was pretty much on side, actually, until you told me about that strike. That Carson's thing, that 20 years from now, 30 years from now, people could be in a position where it's much easier to get all those people into a Harry Potter level expression of these ideas, right? But that the fact that that strike took place, and there's so many other things you could put alongside that as examples, show that we're never going to get to that point. I suspect we're never going to get to that point.
I mean, that's pretty big.
Only just to, and then you go back. Only just to tie to it. What I'm saying is, like, that's why my intuition is what you need is something that right now spreads like a virus, like a religious level virus that makes Harry Potter levels of people be as no more fanatical than I am about Carson's thing. If I saw that there was a critical mass of people behind Carson's thing, I would protest, I would fight, I would be beaten and go to jail. You know what I mean? It would get that level of commitment out of me. And I've only read 2/3 of one of his books, for Christ's sake, right? It's just the inherent logic and undeniable best case, best option available sort of nature of it, right? If you could get that. That's something that you could do now. Imagine being
it's not a program, though, is it? Do you know what I mean?
It's not a program, but it can be
like a program. It's like we broadly know what's involved. Like expropriate the means of production from the capitalist class, put it in the hands of state control, assign sort of ministers and managers and all the rest of it to There's a kind of blueprint, and to do that, you got to take power. And if we have a big sort of revolution, then we can oust the existing.
But if
thing
you
and
had,
we can impose
you
that.
could very
Carson's
easily put a
more
program.
like it. The sort of stuff he's talking about is just it's much more organic. It's like there's all
but
these.
It can be, but
diverse
that's the strength of it. Like I wouldn't be sold. Someone bringing to me a new political ideology wouldn't sell me. But someone coming to me and saying, "Oh, have you not heard?
I know you wouldn't.
In Hebden Bridge, we're federating now. That's what we're doing." And it starts from the bottom. Like if someone said, in Hebden Bridge, if I just found a group of 20 people in a hacker collective that were saying, "No, we're doing this now. We're squatting the land. We're doing this. We're doing that," I would get behind it. And people would get behind it. So there could be. You only need an idea that can grow into something that would be. It just steps outside this sort of prescribed logic of an ideology with a program will come along and then you can get behind it.
I think it has
to come from the bottom
I guess
up.
what I'm saying is
and it has to happen without expectations of spending 5 years bringing it to fruition. It just has to happen. That's something. It has to be idea. It's the potency of the idea. I think there's the religious level idea is the way to put it. It has to be something that even its rationality isn't the thing that's carrying it. Rationality isn't required. It's just captivating. And thank God in this case it's rational as well. But it's the captivating faculty that is the thing that could make it spread quick enough to get a general strike before the system can accommodate these incremental 30 years. You were saying. You know what I mean?
Yeah. But I think the point I was making is the linear progression of the original notion, I guess, of the general strike is look, the workers fucking build it. There's this, there's the realm of appearance, which is kind of, where we trade in these commodities and there's entrepreneurs and there's people making money. But fundamentally, this is all being produced by human labour. And if we turn off that tap, even your AI probably. I mean, we've not got to the point where, without human mediation and facilitation, the system kind of maintains itself. It doesn't. It would just sort of collapse. And so, we want a socialist system. We've kind of got a bit of a blueprint, as to theoretically how it works. General strike is the means by which this apparent power, which is, the capitalist class as represented through its governmental institutions, is just shown to have no clothes. We all go on strike. It's game, set and match. Stand aside. We come in as the vanguard of the proletariat, and we set up. We start to, as I said, reappropriate, socialise the means of production, etc., etc. I guess what they tried to do in Russia. I'm just that all steps through in terms of logic. I'm just saying that the kind of much more diverse organic tapestry of hacker collectives, open source technology, scientific communities governed by Merton's sort of ideals of how science works, with the need for some funding then to be channeled to maintain that kind of that kind of international community around that. Agriculture shifted away from the kind of large-scale monocrop farming back into a more ecological, commons-based approach along the kind of Ostrom lines, and land trusts that kind of take out, sort of land that needs to be managed, 7 generations ahead out of a kind of speculative property market into a trust that sort of treats it as a non-commodity and as a, and some form of social, so in other words, a kind of, real diversity that it would be impossible to provide a blueprint for. So I think that's why more than say the idea of socialism, and the idea that, okay, all we need to do is take hold of the architecture of the state, and then we can kind of quite rapidly, in relatively speaking, sort of start to.
But then you get that whole human frailty thing, and
So that, I'm putting that totally to one. I'm just saying, like, in terms of the logics. So I do understand in that regard why the kind of green shoots and the kind of, as the system starts to kind of enter a more kind of entropy and decay, like it's really important that we build these things, and the system's less capable of incorporating them or quashing them or whatever. But as I said, at a certain point, where the system's in crisis, absolute crisis as a result of that, because the more that was withdrawn, the more it would enter into a kind of state of crisis, the less able it's then to get tax revenue, etc., etc. So, but that confrontation, maybe at that point a kind of general strikes would be required, and especially if you think about the means of violence, because again, in a way, they only have that because of workers. There's someone making the bombs. There's someone making the all the oppressive tool, paramilitary technologies that police are increasingly using to, literally, if those people down tooled as well. So we're not making this shit for you anymore. Yeah, they're going to have a stockpile, but it's only going to last so long. It's only going to take sort of burning so many of the kind of quasi-tanks that they've now got in many police forces, and they're going to run out of rubber bullets and, etc., etc. So, maybe that is required. And I guess all I was saying beforehand was that, there were movements. I guess, the other thing is we still operate, and this is that William I. Robinson's point, and many sort of, socialists that are looking at globalization recognise that capital's gone transnational, but politics is still national, and there is no international, or there's no international kind of socialist movement or whatever, or common action amongst workers of the world, or however you want to put it, like. And I guess in a way, the yellow vests in France, the strikes in India, there would have to be at some level a kind of recognition that, hey, we're all in this together, just as like theorists of imperialism recognised that, and unless this is done kind of collectively, then there's always going to be the other predatory state that's going to come and kind of dominate.